And I think audiences sometimes, when they say they don't get it, but sometimes what they're saying is, I don't know if these people want me here. I don't feel welcome.
All right, everybody, let's do this. I am Drew McManus, the author of Adaptistration, and this is my podcast, Shop Talk, where I invite captivating guests to talk about engaging topics connected to the orchestra business. Today's captivating guests include Scott Silberstein. Scott is a 6-time Emmy Award-winning writer-producer for the 20-time Emmy Award-winning HMS Media. He has developed, produced, and written broadcast, special, and digital content with Renee Fleming, the Lyric Opera of Chicago, Looking Glass Theater Company, David Schwimmer, Hamilton, Dear Evan Hansen, Deeply Rooted Productions, Steppenwolf Theater Company, Tina Fey, The Second City, Celtic Women, The Boston Pops, The Book of Mormon, Court Theater, Wicked, Giordano Dance Chicago, Jersey Boys, Fun Home, Drury Lane Theater, Beautiful, Les Miserables, Chicago Shakespeare Theater, Phantom of the Opera, Marriott Lincolnshire Theater, Mamma Mia, Lucky Plush, Dreamgirls, The Second City, Hairspray, the Goodman Theater, The Color Purple, Writers Theater, and the Joffrey Ballet. Scott is an artistic associate at Looking Glass Theater, a board member at Arts Alliance Illinois, and a member of the Illinois Council for the Broadway League. He was a classically trained pianist and as a musician and sound designer won 3 Ruth Page Awards for Collaborative Artist of the Year and composed the score for the ballet Kira, the Young Hunter with Phil Collins. Hello, Scott.
Lovely to be here. Thanks.
Next up, we have Mark Larson. Mark is the author of Ensemble, an oral history of Chicago theater, for which he conducted over 300 interviews with theater artists. He is an educator who has worked at Evanston Township High School and in education departments at the Field Museum, Lincoln Park Zoo, and the National Louis University. He holds a doctorate in educational leadership, and in addition to Ensemble, he's the author of 2 books in the field of education, Making Conversation, and along with B.J. Wagner, Situations. In 1995, he received the Golden Apple Award for Excellence in Teaching. He is currently working on Edward Asner, Actor and Activist, a composite portrait. Hello, Mark.
Hello, Drew. Thanks for having me.
Thank you both for being here. And we are going to talk about something that, for the folks at home, we're really talking to orchestra marketers and opera marketers, the people who have to come up with figuring out that organization's narrative, the story that you want to tell, the image of that organization that you want to put in people's minds. For those who are on the inside of this business, you will already know that there are many, many, many decades behind the narrative that currently exists, and it has changed very little. And so when I was thinking about this topic and trying to pin down some people who could really bring some insight to help what I know marketing professionals are having trouble with right now, these 2 gentlemen popped into my mind almost instantaneously. Scott has the sort of experience where he's just the epitome of someone who can look at any situation from a perspective that you absolutely have not thought of before. And he can play the scene regardless of what's given to him. Mm-hmm. And from Mark's experience, I know his in-depth research and analysis of especially the theater world here in Chicago, which is in and of itself just a tremendous microcosm of change and evolution over the last 25, 30 years. He probably knows more about that field in all the interconnecting ways than the people who are actually in it. So there really are 2 superb people to be talking about this topic with. So first of all, for the folks at home, guys, what is your experience with and perspective with the orchestra field? Mark, what do you think of as a narrative when you're thinking about orchestras?
I think I remember when I was a high school teacher, I remember taking my high school kids to see the orchestra, to hear the orchestra in Chicago and trying to prep them for that. And so I'm sort of looking at it through their eyes right now. But I remember them wanting very much to get very, very engaged in it and having trouble with that because for them, through a high school student's eyes, it's not a lot of movement. There's not a lot of things happening up in front of them. So I was always trying to prep them for that. For myself, I can remember the first time I heard a live orchestra, and I was blown out of my seat. And what's interesting is when I would try to prep my students, I would say the first time I heard an orchestra, wait until you hear this, because I was so used to just listening to a record. And then I went in and it seemed so three-dimensional to me. You know what I mean? I was just blown out of my seat. And those are two things and they're kind of opposing, but those two things come to my mind when I think of orchestras.
Well, and that actually touched on the exact things that they don't have at their disposal right now.
Right, exactly.
And that's the narrative. And so the narrative, let's touch on that experience when you were teaching. And what was the narrative, the actual verbal narrative that you had to tell the students? Did you get something from the orchestra to be able to prep them, or was this all on you? And what was that message?
It was actually both. Sometimes I would get prepped material. Sometimes it was you just buy the tickets and you show up. But, for the people who are watching and listening to this, I have to say, this goes back, I left teaching high school in 98. So my guess is things have changed dramatically since then in terms of educational outreach and all of that. But at that time, it was playing the music for them, so that they could hear it. But my big idea was they're going to hear it in one dimension and wait till they hear it in three dimensions. Sometimes it was. What I did try to do though was avoid the whole thing of what was the composer? Where did the composer come from? Because that was my musical upbringing, through high school, where you'd have to hear the whole story of where the composer lived and what he was thinking and all of that, and then you listen to it. And so I found that kind of dry.
Scott, what about your perspective?
I only half joke with my mom. In spite of my last name, I was raised Catholic. I have a Jewish dad and a Catholic mom. Which has allowed me to kind of look for common denominators everywhere and never feel entirely a part of anything, which is kind of an interesting way to grow up. But it also, there's some interesting parallels to draw. And I remember I was born in 1964, essentially at the beginning of Vatican II, which for those who are not schooled very much in what happened, that's kind of when the church, to steal Tom Lehrer's line when he did his fantastic parody song, Vatican Rag, that's when the church figured out how to market itself a little more, make the product a little more appealing. And where it decided, you know what, we've had the priest with his back to the congregation speaking in Latin for centuries. Maybe we should turn that priest around and introduce some other ways of communicating. And so I had learned that had happened as a kid, I'm seeing folk guitar masses and a lot of different ways to express all this. And so when I went to see my first orchestral concert, I remember thinking, that guy's like a priest. They should turn him around. What's he doing? I need to see him. So I do remember that feeling of, why is the focal point got his back to us? Now, I understand that there are practical reasons why you can't do it any other way. But that was my first hint at, I wonder if there's some other way to invite people in, or I guess at that point, I'd hate to think people would feel excluded. Because I was taught to be polite growing up. You don't turn your back to someone when you're communicating with them. And so it felt like I didn't quite understand this oppositional stance as a kid. It just struck me, everyone's playing together. But the more I went, the more I understood. But I like asking those questions. And I think it's one of the most enjoyable parts about being an audience member is, you can say why. You don't just have to necessarily sit there and say, well, this is the way it must be this way. I think it's always worth asking, why is the conductor have his back turned to you? Why do I not see the orchestra during opera? Why? There are really good reasons, but it's fun to engage in those questions so you can hear what those reasons are, and that leads to a whole other way to engage.
Let me throw a follow-up really quick into that before I forget, which is, you grew up in classical music. You were always aware of it. It was always a part of you. Yeah. When, if you ever have, consciously become aware of its marketing?
When my grade school would have, there would be youth symphony days, and we would, the whole class would go, and I would I already listened to a lot of this stuff. I already knew this was cool. And I looked around at a lot of the kids that I was going with who didn't get it. And, nothing will breed a certain amount of contempt and distancing than unfamiliarity, or probably more to the point, the feeling of not getting it or feeling stupid. Yeah. And so, there were times where, I grew up in Cincinnati, so I had the pleasure of seeing Eric Kunzel and Carmen de Leon conducting the symphony and the pops, and one or the other were usually at the podium when the youth symphony went. And there were times where I felt like, well, they're really communicating with these kids. And there were other times where I felt like there was this invitation to enjoy spinach, and without letting us know that spinach was actually really, really good and had been seasoned wonderfully. And then also other opportunities. When Star Wars came out, I was 13 when Star Wars came out, and all of a sudden it's an orchestral album that's at the top of the pop music charts. And I always thought, well, here's kids who didn't even think who would tell you they don't like classical music, but are buying Star Wars and listening to it and recognizing all the themes. So that there was somewhere in there was an opportunity, and certainly a lot of symphonies tried that. But I guess it was all of those storytelling opportunities is where that idea first occurred to me.
Listening to Scott talk about that and his relationship to music and to orchestral music and going to it is so interesting to me, because it's so very different from mine. He's coming at it from a very informed place. And certainly, like you said, it was something that you were breathing as a young person. And for me, that wasn't part of my life. And so I'm coming at it from a different position. And I even when you threw me the question, I thought, oh, Jesus, orchestras, I don't know. I found it intimidating. And then as Scott was talking about that, it made me realize, when I've taken friends to the theater who haven't been to the theater. It's what I breathed all the time. Yeah. It's where so I don't know that there are rules. I don't feel like there are rules that I might stupidly break. And I think I felt that way, and my students felt that way going to the symphony. You know what I mean? It's intimidating. And whether it's marketed that way or not, it's the message.
And it reminds me very much of sometimes. So one of the art forms I came to later in life was contemporary dance, and I never really had a difficult time getting into it because I quickly established that it's what music looks like. So I had my music, and not even necessarily, I wouldn't even call it informed work so much as just experience, because there's an awful lot I'm not informed about. As I realized, I recently sent, Drew, when you mentioned the Kira the Young Hunter score that I did with Phil Collins, I sent it to the fabulously talented Holly Mulcahy, violinist extraordinaire, who I believe you're acquainted with.
I am indeed.
And I realize, all you need to do is sit and listen to any of what Holly's done in any of her career. And I'm like, oh my God, I don't know. I've experienced a lot, but I don't know that much. So I think the difference for me was that early on, I had enough experience with that it allowed me to dive into some of these things. But dance is another one, to your point, Mark. People, they go to see contemporary dance and go, oh, I didn't get it. I didn't get it. And it's not that I'm unsympathetic to that. But that said, there is nobody in the history of people who has ever gone to hear an orchestra and heard a symphony orchestra play Beethoven's Fifth. No one's ever heard dun 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 and turned to the next person and went, "The hell did that mean?" Mm-hmm. Right. So some of it, and is it because music is so much more naturally part of our evolution is part than dance? I don't think so. I think as babies are singing and dancing before they're walking and talking. But I think we get trained out of something, and the fear, and I don't know if this is a particularly Western thing or American thing or whatever, but this fear of not getting it, and the reaction to that of I must know, if I don't know it, it is to be feared.
See, that's the question I'd be asking is, where did you get the expectation that there's something specific that you should get and you're probably not?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because I think I was talking to a 90-year-old guy who was trying to get into a Zoom thing that I was doing. And he came at it as, I'm not going to get this, I'm already in that frame of mind. One of the smartest piece of marketing advice or thoughts that I've ever heard, and it pertains to this, was I had a brilliant boss at the Field Museum who was the director that I worked with. And she said, because we were the education people, so we were the front of it to the people coming in. And she said, we want everything that happens here to just the message to be implied. We've been expecting you.
I love that.
This is for you, because one of the things we're overcoming is all those steps, that Supreme Court building looking front that's meant to be auspicious. I know I'm going to do something wrong when I get there. So what can we do to have an implied message? We've been expecting you.
I had this conversation with a good pal of mine, Michelle Kranicki, who's the founder, or a co-founder and artistic director of Zephyr Dance, a contemporary dance company here in Chicago. And I don't remember the exact context of where this conversation started, but she basically said, what do you say to people who say, I don't get it? And my response, and it felt glib at the time, although I think it might be onto something, which is, of course you get it. We got it from you. I mean, we're human beings. We're moving around. We're not moving around in a back. We got the 2 arms, 2 legs, torso. We got all of this stuff, and we, whatever we're doing up here, it's a reflection of what we're experiencing out there. This is yours. This was yours before it was ours. We're just playing around with this idea. When people lose that, and that sense of we belong here. We belong in theaters. These are stories for us. This was created not to baffle us, but to entertain or engage or instruct or just pull us together. When audiences lose that, or perhaps even more to the point, when the people responsible for putting those performances on, and it could be someone who's reading poetry in their living room, or it could be the most ginormous opera company in the history of the universe. If at any certain point there is the sense of bequeathing as opposed to embracing, things go downhill really, really fast. And I think you can see it in performers. I think you can see it in directors. I think you can see it on, the way television's edited, the way all of this stuff. I think you can get a sense, if you just step back and stop trying to understand it. I think you can get a sense of, are these guys doing this for me? And if they're doing it for themselves, am I included in that as well? Like, is it a me or an us thing? Because, we're all trying to express something. I don't think, when I'm writing something, I want to make something I would like. But if I'm making it just for me, or if I think I'm more special, or if I think I'm exclusive in some way, or if even in a good-hearted way, I think, boy, how do I make sure other people get this? I mean, I get it, but how do I make sure those people don't get it? But those people get it. Then shame on me. I've already lost, And I think audiences sometimes, when they say they don't get it, I think what they're sometimes they haven't allowed themselves room to move into it. But sometimes what they're saying is, I don't know if these people want me here. I don't feel welcome. So to your point, Mark, that's it. And I think museums can do it. Everybody can do it. They can make you feel you're not welcome or expected, or just you haven't earned it yet. And that's the problem.
I think it's baked into the arts, though, too. I think it was very deliberate at one time, and we're still living with that. I really do believe that. A parallel to that is a friend of mine, an older friend, used to use the phrase, if he got frustrated at the airport because we had to travel on business together, and he'd say, the problem today is anybody can fly. You know what I mean? And I think at some point, that was a real phrase.
Yeah.
Oh, it was, yes.
Yeah, and I do think there is an elitism that continues, and I think what my boss, her name is Mary Ellen Munley, what she was trying to say was we need to start to dissolve that. If we're going to raise a generation of kids that go, oh, look at all those pillars, let's go up there, as opposed to I hope I don't do something wrong, and that just creates an anger and a resentment and a rejection.
Absolutely. And now I'm getting excited about this, because now we're starting to move in the direction that I'm, was hoping we were really going to start to move to, because without even trying to make it happen, I'm watching both of you gravitate toward exactly what are all the problems with your initial descriptions about the field. And then Mark, you just kind of came back full circle in this, saying that, yeah, it feels like this is the message that, has been very crafted and curated and presented to us as this is right. But now with the field and the place where it's at, we're seeing groups do the one of two things. They're either just shutting down and saying, fuck it, we're gone for a year. And, come back and you'll hear the same message again when we're back up and running. Or there are groups that are trying to branch out and do something different. They are becoming digital content creators. You take away all of the stuff that you guys were touching on that makes the experience what it was in your mind and how you're framing it. But it's the same basic product if you look at it from that perspective. Orchestras still now have to figure out how to, technically deliver it, but that's actually a smaller hurdle compared to packaging it from a marketing message or a communications message. And the liberating aspect about this, and I want to throw this idea out there and get your responses from it, is we now no longer have the pretense. We now no longer have the trappings. We now no longer are shackled by all the things that have contributed to what you're talking about. And there's this brand new wide open frontier. It is a white blank piece of paper, which is scary, but what have you seen in your careers and your histories, your observations of other groups and other fields that have done this or have gone down this path already that can benefit orchestras?
Wow.
Yeah, well, I think partly the pause is we're still in a very nascent state of this.
Yeah.
I mean, this is still very new for everybody. But it's a brilliant observation that, you know what, this thing that feels so onerous, this is an opportunity because we don't have all those. We don't have the pillars at the columns, at the Field Museum right now. Maybe that's an opportunity.
Yeah, we when COVID hit and the shutdown, the week before the shutdown, we were on location shooting a PBS special with the tour of Come From Away, and then suddenly it all, the thing that was so unnerving to so many people, it was just so fast and everything went so dark so immediately. Yeah. And so if there was a gift in that, and there are always gifts in crises, and Lord knows I've had to remind myself a lot last year, personally and professionally, because sometimes it's an awfully small gift given the crisis. But there are gifts nevertheless. One of them is we got quiet for a moment, and we had to sit down and do a little more listening, and ask a lot of questions and question things that we'd never really had to question before. And I don't mean like question is being part of an opera organization a good idea, but why? I think something everyone can relate to now. We're questioning if we ever need to go into the office. Now, I think there are reasons to go into an office. I think there's reasons to be face-to-face. But there are certain things that I think we're all looking at going, boy, do we have to do everything the way we've been doing it? And I think the more entrenched the rituals and traditions, the more opportunities that we have right now to say why. And even if we come to the same conclusion and say, yeah, this is what we should be doing, but now we have an idea of why, as opposed to, well, my boss's mentor's boss told me how to do it, and so this is how it's done. Mm-hmm. So, again, it's not, the idea here isn't everything that a large arts organization is doing must be changed, but there are opportunities to answer the question, why have we been doing it that way? And I think that's really interesting, because it forces you to think about not the task at hand, but the people that you're trying to reach. We've had to redesign how we communicate, and Lord knows we've all had to get better at listening. Or we've been invited to get better at listening. That's not necessarily something that people are. And this is a tricky thing, right? Because we all have microphones at home, right? When COVID hit, the internet was flooded with arts content. Everybody had something to say and felt that they didn't say it immediately, they were going to die. And you compare what the content that's being released now to the content that was coming out in March, April. It's very different. It's by and large, I think, is more thoughtful and more sophisticated. And it maybe fewer people are watching, fewer people are making it. We had to filter out a lot of noise. Mm-hmm. So, I think Mark, I remain curious, and Mark and I have been in regular contact throughout all this as we have attempted to find the best way to tell stories about this extraordinary theater world here in Chicago. And, Mark has forgotten more about theater than I'll ever know. I mean, I don't know that there's anyone in the city who knows more about this. So Mark, I'm curious about what you've seen, how you've seen institutions. And, I know regional theater companies aren't opera companies, but some of them are as old as some opera companies, and some of them are as entrenched. And they're all institutions. They all have a name, exactly. Whether it's Lyric Opera or it's the Goodman Theater or Looking Glass, they all have a name and traditions and people who have been there for a very long time. What are you seeing? What kind of pivots are you seeing? Is it just hunkering down, or are you seeing actual pivots?
I think what I'm seeing is the beginning of the pivot, because we were in shock. And I do think there were a couple months where we thought, it'll just be a couple months. Yeah. Now we're beginning to realize this is the long term. We're beginning to realize we really need to make some significant changes. And what I'm seeing is, I think someday we'll be able to look back on this, hopefully. We'll look back on this, and there'll be this early epoch of this whole thing. And like any kind of transition, you take parts of the past and try to apply it to the new situation. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So if you look at television, when television first came in and nobody knew what to do with it, they just did radio on television. Right?
It's an excellent parallel. Yeah.
Right?
That's exactly what we do. And I think we're in that phase of, we've got a TV now. What do we do with it? And we're kind of just putting on the TV, we're putting on the Zoom what we used to do. And now we're trying to figure out, well, what does this new element really offer us in terms of opportunities? That's what I'm beginning to see, is starting to pivot. I was thinking, I can remember sitting with you, Drew, and Holly mm-hmm. at your dinner table and listening to music that Holly had commissioned, I believe, and that played a big role in. And we listened mm-hmm. to it part by part and stopped and talked about it. And I can remember walking, do you remember that night?
Oh, yeah.
I can remember getting so excited because I'd never had that intimate a conversation about music or opportunity. So that was sort of in the back of my mind. But now as we're having this conversation, what are we pivoting to? It could be that Zoom allows that intimacy, that mm-hmm. moment of intimacy that people haven't had, that like I had never had. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
It could become personalized. It could become more intimate. And then when I go to the symphony, once we're all finally free to go back, I see it differently. And I know I walked away from your dinner table thinking, when I hear music in the future, I'm going to hear it slightly differently because of that experience. You see what I mean? So maybe this whole thing that we're going through could be, that was a microcosm of it.
I think that's absolutely the direction that things, for some groups, are going. I used the phrase early on in the conversation, content creators, which is the kind of catch-all for that sector that's grown up inside YouTube and Instagram and TikTok and everything else, where people use that platform to create their content, and the nature of the platform shapes how the content is created. And the nature of that platform is the interaction that you just described, Mark, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
It has struck me the parallels between all of the things that I see orchestras, operas, and arts groups in general become frustrated with or become stymied by are the exact same problems that content creators figured out and encountered, and in some cases are still dealing with 3 to 4 years ago. How do you go from just creating content where you're talking into the camera and people are consuming it to now, like if you've ever watched a gamer do live streaming, they're actually still doing the game and broadcasting that and the rest of it, but they are talking to up to a dozen people at one time and having all these conversations, and that input impacts what they're doing there. And it's basically this larger sense of a created product. that someone now has a part of, and there's more of a vested stakeholdership because of that interaction. And that is decidedly different for arts groups. And that's what I've noticed. Scott, you mentioned earlier, and I want to dive into this a little bit more, of the arts groups, the content they're creating now is very different from when they started shotgunning stuff out in the beginning of March and April. Yeah, you got a microphone, you got a camera, boom, it's out there. It's gotten better. But to my eye, it's improved in production quality, some, but it's still that same basic, we do this at you. And there isn't a whole lot of the give and take going on.
It's tricky because so many of these art forms are they're interactively presentational. The agreement is we go in and we sit down, and the response that you get from us, that you on stage get from us, is our applause, the attention we're paying, the way we're leaning in, the way we're breathing. And I think about this on multiple sides, as an artistic associate at Looking Glass, my thought is, what is it like for the people who come here to receive the story we are telling? Which I think in Looking Glass, I think is a wonderful example of this, because it's a beautiful example of best idea in the room wins, and do things democratically and make sure everything's in service to a story, because now you're going to have the purest empathic experience between the storytellers on stage and the story receivers. And I think of audiences, we are story receivers, story reflectors. We're not passive. So the hard part about this is that with this glass between us, separated by time and space, we can't. It's not just that we're in 2D now. We can't hear each other breathe. We can't feel that. We can't feel the temperature in the room rise a little bit. And those of us, making it can do a second take, and those of us at home can hit pause. The hope is a year from now, we're back doing what we were doing. The question is, what else has happened? Most theater companies I've talked to have said streaming's here to stay. There will always have to be some kind of streaming component. A good chunk of our audience, and I would imagine this is a major concern to opera companies, and so for anybody whose demographic, whose ticket buyers are 50 plus, are worried about who's going to want to sit shoulder to shoulder to shoulder to shoulder. The research indicates that if we got the all clear from whatever trusted institution happens to be running the country at the time, that there are a good chunk of this population that's saying, I'm not going back for 12 or more months.
Yeah, hang on, because we were in a really good rabbit hole, and you backed out and went to another really good rabbit hole. Mark, I think you wanted to jump in on one of those points that Scott was making. Do you remember what that was?
Yeah, I think maybe you were talking about, I don't know how engaging, how much engagement there can be.
Yeah.
Right. Sort of, I can't, maybe it's not going to be as much engagement. And I was thinking maybe that's where we have to start unhitching ourselves from our older expectations. That's when we're really going to take off, I think. And what I was going to say was, it's not about engagement then, maybe. It's about intimacy, maybe.
Yeah.
Definitely have intimacy. Okay, how do we build with that? Let's acknowledge what this is. Because, I used to do book talks, and I'd go and talk to a group of people, then we do Q&A and all of that stuff. And when that switched to Zoom, we were always trying to recreate that experience in one dimension. And, it's people are writing their questions in chat rooms, and it's, I can hardly see it. And it's, we have to forget that, unhitch ourselves from it, and then be able to take off. Because I'll tell you what gets me very excited is I think this is going to stretch us into something extremely new.
Yeah, I agree.
And once we go back, because the invention is the mother of whatever it is. Necessity is
the mother of invention.
Yes. And that's going to come into play here, right? That's going to come into play. And I think we're going to stretch really far so that when we do come back, because that day will come, it's not going to be as soon as we want, but the day will come We're going to go back then having stretched. And maybe it's even going to be sort of a hybrid of what we've invented in the meantime with the the live performances. You see what I mean?
I do.
That's what excites me, is let's just let go of what we can't have because we can't have it. Right?
Right.
How do we build with what we've got? One last point on this, another metaphor. I taught English. When I clean a drawer, I don't know what you guys do, but I rarely do it. But when I pull a drawer out that's just full of clutter, the way I do it is I take it out and then dump everything and then put everything back in one at a time. And you're like, what? I don't think this pen even works. You know what I mean?
I just did this today, Mark. I just did this in one of my bathrooms. Yeah, exactly this thing.
And I think that's what we're going to go through, right? Do we really?
Yeah, we can throw out the 6 tubes of old chapstick that we haven't used now. We're never going to use them. Yeah, just cluttering things up. I think you're exactly right. Intimacy is even in something as grand as opera or in symphonic music. The connection is one that is intimate, one that brings you back to yourself.
If I was working in a company, this is a phrase, actually 3 sentences that I would put up on the wall or wherever you put it. I interviewed Barbara Gaines, who, for your audience, is the founder and artistic director of Chicago Shakespeare Theater.
And who's directed at Lyric Opera brilliantly, too.
Right. And I was asking her about how they're dealing with this situation. And she said, I said to something the other day, this is the room we're in. Let's learn to live in it better from this moment forward. And I use that in some of my talks, and I just even, spell out those words because they're so powerful. This is the room we're in. Let's learn to live in it better from this moment on.
And Barbara knows what she's talking about too, right? Because she started that company, and their first performance was on the roof of a pub. Right. And then they had to find a room they could live in. And then they had the opportunity to design a complex with 1 and 2 and ultimately 3 rooms and figure out not only how to design the room that they could live in, but how could that room be as flexible as possible to have experiences that they haven't yet anticipated that they would like to have. There's something really cool about having built something from the ground up. And that gets tricky when you're part of institutions that are they're older, that have big giant buildings and have things, done the way they're done. Let's be honest, a lot of times some of the restrictions are because there are rules and regs on either the labor side or the institution side that are just not possible to change, or certainly not possible to change easily. And so that setting is tricky. That feels, so in that sense, I think some of the things we're talking about might feel counterintuitive because you can immediately see the hurdles to that. There are just things we cannot do. And, that's a great time to say why. And not that unions can or should change all their rules, not that organizations should be, it's not that so much, but it is a fantastic opportunity to go, why did we say you have to do this? There must have been a reason for it apart from because we wanna, right? For all I know, some of the rules did come out that way, but to really ask those questions you might find people, you would hope. And I think you can do this in the arts almost better than any other field, because the arts, theaters are the one place, I don't care what you're going to see. That's the one place I can think of left where we can all walk into a room, not know a thing about the majority of people there, and all root for and hope for the same thing, right? We all want to be at the least entertained or distracted. We all want to be transported. We all want to have something cool to talk about. The best behavior I've ever seen in parking garages are after shows, right? I've seen, that's when your people go, no, you go ahead, you merge there. Because we've all shared this thing.
Not at an orchestra concert.
So why, Drew? Because, there are, I think that's a really interesting thing to, you as the host of this, to say that. I think that's a really interesting thing for us to dive into. Why?
Well, and maybe what we'll do here is we're kind of at a good point time-wise where we might wrap this up. But everything we've been talking about, and Scott, what you just unintentionally set up, I pulled up one of my favorite quotes that popped into my mind about halfway through watching the two of you interact with each other, especially, and then the way you're talking about organizations interacting with each other. And so there'll be like a little after segment that we're going to record.
Okay.
Right? And it's a quote from Stephen R. Covey, which is, most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. And what you described, Scott, with the theater world is very much listening to understand. And the opera orchestra world is very much listening with the intent to reply. There's a process we'll go through. And so on that, we're actually going to leave things off right here and come back. So for this episode, let me thank both of my guests, Scott Silberstein and Mark Larson. And for everybody to pop in with this, you'll have to wait a couple days for the little after show to come out at the end of the week. But until now and then, bye-bye, everybody.
Oh, I hope this anesthesia wears off soon. I'm of no good to you at this point. Let's go. Here we go.